woman who gave birth to Malcolm. Louise and young later, a freedom fighter too. A famous Grenadian, she come from England. Louise and young.
Is Dr. Bright Gyamfi. He is an assistant professor of history at the University of California, San Diego, and a former presidential fellow at Northwestern University. Gyamfi's research sits at the intersection of West African and African diaspora, intellectual history, nationalism, Pan-Africanism, Black internationalism, and economic development. He writes on African intellectuals who worked to transform and to radicalize the study of Africa in academic and intellectual centers around the Atlantic. He has received research fellowships and grants from several organizations and institutions, including the Social Science Research Council, the Fulbright IIE, the U.S. Department of State's Benjamin A. Gilman International Scholarship Program, Northwestern University, the University of Oxford, and the University of Notre Dame. His work has appeared in the Journal of African American History, African Studies Review, Africa is a Country, and The Conversation. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in History Honors and Political Science from the University of Notre Dame, and Masters of Science in African Studies from the University of Oxford, and a PhD in History from Northwestern University. Bright is Ghanaian by birth and will deliver the 2025 IPE and UE Annual Commemorative Emancipation Public Lecture on Monday, July 28th. That's the date we have to mark in our calendars. On the topic, The African Struggle is Our Struggle, the African Dimensions of the Grenadian Revolution. Let's welcome Dr. Bright Gyamfi as he shares with us this evening.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And I'm also very grateful to the IPE for the invitation and for my colleagues here today. So today I've been thinking about what to talk about when it comes to Malcolm X. Most of the time when we think about Malcolm X, Louise Little, the story, especially coming from the US, is a very much a US-centered narrative. And this narrative was also cemented by the autobiography of Malcolm X that Alex Haley crafted. And in it, we don't get a true sense of the internationalism that shaped the politics of Malcolm X, as well as his mother, Louise Little. So my invitation is what happens when we think about these internationalism, when we think about the role of Africa, continental Africa, and its connection to the diaspora, which brings us to Marcus Garvey. Garvey was heavily influenced by an activist from the Gold Coast named Chief Sam. They both were in London together, and Chief Sam also embodied this idea of the Back to Africa movement. The Back to Africa movement, which Marcus Garvey takes to another level with his UNIA movement that he establishes first in Jamaica, which Louise Little becomes a member. Marcus Garvey's idea of back to Africa, of rupturing this colonial racial order that sought to create a hierarchy of Black people at the bottom with whiteness at the top, was significant. And it was this significance of rupturing the colonial racial order was part of the attempt to silence, erase, and defame somebody like Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey had a major influence on a young Ghanaian intellectual who came to the United States to come and study by the name Kwame Nkrumah. When Nkrumah was coming to the US to study at Lincoln University, which we all know is a historically Black university in Philadelphia. When he was in London, when he was waiting for his visa to be approved to come to the US, Italy had just invaded Ethiopia. And Nkrumah recalled that he felt that the whole of London had attacked him, that he was coming to understand the connection between the colonial imperialist project was not one that can be thought about as a local phenomenon, but as a global enterprise. When he comes to the United States, he goes to Harlem. And we have to understand that Harlem is a space of Black internationalism. It's a space where scholars and activists from the Caribbean, from the US, from the African continent are having conversation about what it means to be Black, about what it means to create a world after empire. And this was what was shaping these intellectuals. It was in Harlem where Nkrumah began to read extensively the works of Marcus Garvey, his Back to African movement, his idea that Black people must unite, that we must challenge the negative stereotypes that have shaped the way Black people were being conceived. It was this negative representation of Black people as backwards, as primitive, that gave birth to the first Pan-African movement in 1900 that took place in London. Fast forward, when we get to 1945, you have the Fifth Pan-African Congress. And what makes the Fifth Pan-African Congress unique was the battle to argue that Africans and people of the Caribbean want their independence now. There was the famous slogan, independence today, independence now, which shifted away from these previous conception of a gradual movement towards independence. And scholars and activists like George Padmore from Trinidad and Tobago, Kwame Nkrumah, W.B. Du Bois from the United States made the argument that the battle for independence must be waged on the African continent. Fast forward a few years after the Fifth Pan-African Congress, Kwame Nkrumah returns to Ghana and by 1957 leads Ghana to its independence. And on Independence Day, Nkrumah famously states that we are today, he declares that the Black man is capable to show the world that they are ready to govern themselves. He goes on to say that Ghana's independence is meaningless unless it is linked with a total liberation of the African continent. Ghana, for so many people, became a haven for Black global political activity. Kwame Nkrumah supported many African leaders who were seeking to break away from colonial domination. He gave them support. Those who were coming from the Caribbean, he offered them support as well. As a matter of fact, there were a number of Caribbean thinkers, intellectuals who were part of Nkrumah's cabinet. Most prominently, George Padmore, who had created the African Bureau to ensure that Ghana was helping to coordinate other anti-colonial activities wherever Black people found themselves. To the point that during Ghana's independence, Martin Luther King came to Ghana to witness this important achievement. Du Bois, who had his passport taken away from him, was also in Ghana where he became a Ghanaian citizen. As a matter of fact, in 1909, Du Bois had come up with the project entitled the Encyclopedia Africana, where he wanted to study the culture and the politics of African peoples globally. Unfortunately, Du Bois could not get the funding and the support that he needed. But in 1962, in Nkrumah's Ghana, he got the necessary support to undertake this massive and important project. For so many people, Ghana had become, in the words of the historian, African-American historian Kevin Gaines, Ghana had become the destination of radical hope. It was this destination of radical hope that a young Grenadian activist found himself. Malcolm X came to Ghana to also witness this particular moment in history. In the biography of Malcolm X, Alex Haley does not, in my humble opinion, do a better job describing the impact of this visit for Malcolm X. In the biography, Alex Haley just notes Malcolm X met a chief. Full stop. The chief that Malcolm X met was called Nana Kwabena Ketia IV. Here was a chief, a traditional chief, who had broke ranks with other chiefs as well to side with Nkrumah to declare independence. He was arrested by the colonial government. His bones were broken. His palace was destroyed because he wanted his people to be free. And after independence, he was on stage with Nkrumah, where he advised the president to create the Institute of African Studies to challenge the way that Africa had been perceived. And it was at this moment in time that he connected with Malcolm X. And in order to get a better picture of what took place at that meeting, we have to look at the autobiography of Maya Angelou, All of God's Children Need Traveling Shoes, where she takes the time to detail that particular moment. Maya writes, and I quote, "When Malcolm met Nana Nketia, the two men acted magnetized. I had not heard Nana speak so quietly, nor seen Malcolm listen so deeply." End of quote. This particular relationship gives us the import of what Africa and African American and African diaspora relations meant for the global liberation of Black people. That it begs the question that we cannot think about these global entanglement as separated. When Nkrumah was overthrown, backed by the CIA in 1966, people like Nketia had to be pushed into exile because the new military government that came into power was very much anti-Nkrumah. But these relationships then helped Nketia to come to the United States. Maya Angelou played a key role in this relationship, and whereby Nketia helped establish the Institute Black Studies departments in the United States, specifically at UMass Amherst. And when he was at UMass Amherst, he connected with Black Power intellectuals, people like Stokely Carmichael, Michael Thirlwell from Jamaica. And Nketia had also spent significant amount of time traveling through the African diaspora in Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Brazil, Suriname. And he began to understand the import of stressing the ongoing similarities between Africa and the African diaspora. Malcolm X, through his travel, also came to understand the import of Africa and its relation to the rest of the world. He will go on, Malcolm X, to try to convince a number of African leaders to take the United States to court, to the UN, and sue them for human rights. Malcolm's story is a global story. It's a story in which Grenada is pivotal to this particular project. It is a story where the African continent is pivotal at this juncture. It is not just an American story, but it is a global story. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gyamfi, for that thought-provoking historical journey that caused on us to shift our perspective. Because oftentimes, as we hear Malcolm X, and sometimes you get the comment, why are we commemorating his story here in Grenada? Why are we having this? And I think you did an excellent job, because Malcolm X's story, the US-centric story that they sell us, is not his entire story. And we see the Pan-Africanism, the Caribbean, the globe, the world. And we see Grenada, as you rightly said, it's a global story. And Grenada has a pivotal role in that story. So as we reflect on your words, I would like to, just admonish our listeners and everyone present with us today to think beyond. Don't be afraid to widen your horizon and to learn, to delve deeper, because there is a connection. And we can see that radical spirit and the negative perspective that they sometimes paint of Blacks or Africans, we have to always challenge it, because there was a purpose in that meeting, in those travels, and there is a connection right there. So thank you again, Dr. Gyamfi. I now hand you over to my co-moderator, Tesfa.
Thank you, Marieve.
Malcolm X is known the world over as a civil rights leader, black nationalist fighter,